Before I start, can I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet and pay my respects to elders past and present. Acknowledge our guest speaker, Professor Simon Chapman, AO, distinguished guests, fellows of the Academy, ladies and gentlemen. As all of you, I'm sure, will be aware, the Cunningham Lecture is the Academy's flagship event of the year. It was named after the first chairman of the Social Science Research Committee, which was in fact the predecessor organisation to the Academy, Dr. Kenneth Stewart Cunningham, and he was chairman from 1943 to 1952. In 1930, he was appointed Foundation CEO of the Australian Council for Educational Research, and in this role had a tremendous impact on the development of Australian educational research. Following his retirement in 1954, he remained very actively devoted to education. He was chair of ASSA, and then he worked in Indonesia for UNESCO for a period. So it's very fitting that the flagship lecture for the Academy should be named after such an eminent social scientist, and each year we seek an equally eminent social scientist to deliver the lecture. So I'm very pleased and delighted that Professor Simon Chapman, AO, Fellow of the Academy, agreed to present tonight's lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Debbie, for that introduction. I too would like to acknowledge the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of the land, and to give my respects to owners past and present. When Debbie called me up some months ago to ask me if I would like to do this lecture, I was very honoured, of course, and not a little bit shocked. But I accepted, and here I am tonight. And she said to me, look, you can really pick your topic. You know, she'd approached me because she thought I embodied qualities and experiences that I think she hopes that the Academy could be doing more of. And so I said, well, do you want me to talk about gun control? Or I've done a lot of work against the anti-immunisation lobby, and more recently I've been doing some really engaging work looking at psychogenic aspects of wind turbine syndrome, people who believe that wind turbines cause all sorts of problems, and that's taken me into sorts of whole areas of conflict. And of course, with the tobacco industry, I've been doing that for about 35 years, and so that's been a very interesting and often bumpy ride along the way. And of course, along the way, I've copped an awful lot of abuse. I sort of make a bit of a hobby of collecting this, and I have a file that I add some of the best ones to. And I was recently called by a UK libertarian who's got a certain way with words, a creepy sociologist, a reptilian sociologist, the irksome, omnipresent uber wowser, and my wife's favourite, which she actually had made into a plaque, which is stuck on the back wall, the scrotum-faced headbanger, Simon Chapman. I play in a rock band, so headbanger, that's where that comes from. Here's a little photoshopped example of artwork that you may enjoy. This was done by the e-cigarette lobby, who, for reasons I don't quite understand, really don't like me, because my views on e-cigarettes are certainly not made up. My mind's not made up about it. But obviously, when you're working in the areas of change and challenging vested interests, and some of those are very big and powerful vested interests, it can upset a lot of people. But I've elected to talk tonight, as you know, about plain packaging. Now, on the 1st of December 2012, Australia became the first country to implement plain packaging of tobacco products. The legislation was unopposed by the opposition and supported by the Greens and all the independents except Bob Katter. No nation has ever mandated the entire appearance of packaging for any consumer product. So this historic legislation was once exceptional and radical. And it was also a massive threat to the transnational tobacco industry, which quickly unleashed an unprecedented global campaign, which is still in process today, to try and defeat the bill and deter other nations from following Australia. Across my 35-year career in tobacco control, I've really never seen anything like it. The tobacco industry spent well over $14 million on TV and other media campaigns. It was humiliated in a failed 6-1 High Court challenge loss. It encouraged corrupt and several puppet governments with zero tobacco trade with Australia to launch complaints in the World Trade Organisation. They're still, of course, to be heard. It funded folksy AstroTurf retail groups who dutifully screamed in high dudgeon about the catastrophic job losses which would occur when the policy that was repeatedly predicted to not work would actually do exactly what it was meant to do and reduce tobacco sales. And it donated to the Institute of Public Affairs, where the resident errand boys dutifully telegraphed their masters' voices about how the nanny state was now completely running amok. In tobacco control, we call these reactions the scream test of policy potency. We're very amused when the industry supports anodyne, useless campaigns like these, and we know that we're on the right track when they behave as they did over plain packaging. For over a century, this industry has packaged its carcinogenic products in highly consumer-tested boxes. These are designed to maximise their appeal and to distract from the grim consequences that we know now occur in a majority of smokers. We know from many internal tobacco industry documents and feature articles in almost every issue of every tobacco trade magazine that packaging is the front and centre of branding. Brand personality is built on brand name and packaging, and all other forms of promotion hang off it. Plain packaging makes the unavoidable statement that of all consumer goods, tobacco is exceptionally deadly and so deserving of the exceptional status that plain packaging signifies. While the industry repeated endlessly that plain packs would not work and that there was no evidence it would, privately it was saying just the opposite, that it would devastate sales, to which, of course, the only reply was, well, actually, that's the whole idea. Now, perhaps most amusingly at all, it advanced the reasoning that because no nation had ever introduced plain packaging, there was therefore no evidence that it would work and therefore that it should not proceed. In this, it drew from F.N. Cornford's 1908 political science masterpiece, Microcosmographica Academia, which I'm sure you've all read, in which we received the sagacious advice that every public action which is not customary is either wrong, or if it's right, it sets a dangerous precedent, and it follows that nothing should ever be done for the first time. Now, Australia, along with 177 other nations, is a signatory to the World Health Organisation's Framework Convention on Tobacco Control. This obliges all signatories to ban all tobacco advertising and promotion. After Gough Whitlam introduced the bill to ban direct tobacco advertising on radio and television that took effect in 1976, another 16 years passed before we nearly finished the job in 1992 with the Tobacco Advertising Prohibition Act. This ended all remaining forms except the most important of all, the pack itself. And it's very important to understand that plain packaging legislation is simply finishing that job off. Smoking rates have been occasionally flat, but mostly falling since the early 1960s. Public awareness campaigns have conditioned community support for policies like advertising bans and plain packaging, but an individual's decision to quit or not start can only be crudely be attributed to single ingredients of policy and campaigns. Instead, all elements of comprehensive tobacco control work synergistically in concert. And here, it's important to understand that the average fall in tobacco consumption, that is the amount of tobacco consumed in a nation, over the past 30 years has only been about 0.5% a year. The slide in smoking prevalence, the proportion of people who smoke, is moving even more slowly. So plain packaging is really like adding a slow-burning log to that fire. It will keep the heat under the historic de-glamorising of smoking. Smoking used to mean things like this, and now it means this. It's never been thought of as a policy, plain packaging, that would suddenly wipe out smoking overnight. Nothing has ever worked like that in tobacco control. It's about shifting perceptions of smoking in emerging new generations of young people who will now grow up having never seen a box stuffed with potent carcinogens, packaged like a designer box of precious secrets. Any impacts on dedicated smokers are going to be a bonus. Now, today I want to give some insights into how this unprecedented and historical development happened. Early next year, I have the unenviable task of having to traipse over to the Rockefeller Centre at Bellagio and Lake Como, where, this is the worst part, each night I'll be force-fed Italian food and wine for a whole month in between finishing off a book on how it all happened. But in selecting what to emphasise today, I'll highlight the role of research and multidisciplinary academic expertise in informing and supporting policy change. And I'll talk particularly about the central role of news media in framing policy debates over the years about tobacco that provided foundational narratives for the plain packs debate when it recommenced in 2007. I'll also talk about some related work that I've done into the characteristics of Australian researchers who are regarded by their peers and by policymakers as being the most influential in their fields, because this has been a great example of public health research community influencing something very big. But first, for any Rip Van Winkles here today who may have missed this, let me explain the basics. Tobacco produces statistics to die for. David O'Reilly, the head of science at British American Tobacco, agreed last month that there were 50 million smoking-related deaths in the 20th century, and that this was expected to reach a staggering 1 billion this century. Most of these will occur in low-income nations where often illiterate smokers have little idea of the risks involved. The most recent estimates of the deaths from smoking-caused diseases in the mature epidemic that we now have in Australia shows that 2 in 3 long-term users will die on average 10 years earlier than normal life expectancy because they smoked. But Dr. O'Reilly emphasises that the world would be a poorer place without nicotine. It has helped people through world wars, the stress of everyday life, and it has helped people suffering from Parkinson's and dementia. It's a wonderful drug, he says. I think this is a little bit like arguing that the Titanic was a wonderful ship because the dance band and the caviar were truly excellent. Now, lung cancer was a rare disease before the 1930s, and by the late 1950s it had grown to become the world's leading form of cancer death. And in nations like Australia, which have taken tobacco control seriously, male lung cancer at least has been on the wane since 1980. I think I've jumped ahead. No, I've left out a slide. Female lung cancer rates seem unlikely to ever reach even half the peak rates which have been seen in males. And so this has been really a tremendous achievement. Lung cancer is a disease that we'll probably see off in about the next 30 or 40 years. The idea of requiring tobacco packs to be generic or plain, with brands distinguished only by their names on the box, was first suggested by a Canadian doctor in 1986. After a 1992 recommendation that it be adopted here, some early testing of its likely impact and advocacy for the concept in New Zealand, and an aborted attempt to introduce it in Canada in the 1990s, it went dormant for a decade as the tobacco industry successfully framed the proposal as a fool's errand for any government to consider. The industry succeeded in frightening governments into believing that they would face massive compensation bills when courts determined that the company's intellectual property had been confiscated by laws that suppressed the use of trademarks and colours. But in August 2012, the Australian High Court ruled 6-1 that this argument was nonsense. There is a right to register a trademark and to prevent others from using it, but there is no right to use a trademark. In 2006, with some others, including Matthew Rimmer, who's in the audience tonight, I started an NHMRC project grant on the future of tobacco control. And in 2007, we published a review of the limited experimental evidence on the data, together with insights into the importance of packaging found in internal tobacco industry documents and in its retail trade press, where there was no hesitation at all about talking about packaging as a major promotional strategy. There we found statements like this: product package is the communication lifeblood of the firm. It's the silent salesman that reaches out to customers. Packaging acts as a promotional tool in its own right. If you smoke, a cigarette pack is one of the few things that you use regularly that makes a statement about you. A cigarette pack is the only thing you take out of your pocket 20 times a day and lay out for everyone to see. That's a lot different than buying your soap powder in generic packaging. Going on, if your brand can no longer shout from the billboards because of advertising bans, let alone from the cinema screen or the pages of a glossy magazine, it can at least court consumers from the retailer's shelf or from wherever it has been placed by those already wed to it. And when we offered them Marlboros at half price in generic brown boxes, only 21% were interested, even though we assured them that each package was fresh, had been sealed at the factory and was identical except for the different packaging to that they normally bought. The consumer is expressing how he wants to be seen by others. Now, in public health research, the whole idea is to produce work that is useful to informing public opinion and leveraging policy interest about control options. I've never seen any sense myself in spending 4 years researching and publishing work that will only be read by a few hundred colleagues closeted behind journal subscription paywalls. So when I publish something, I generally push it out there, distributing it to relevant people and writing journalistic pieces to accompany the publication of my research papers. We circulated the paper I've just described widely amongst Australian colleagues and to some 5,000 members of a global internet listserv. My sense was that the main objective at the time was to first re-oxygenate the dormant concept of plain packs among the global tobacco control community to allow it to become part of the continuing narrative of what was needed if nations were to get serious about turbocharging the falls in smoking. I didn't, though, at the time, write newspaper articles or blogs to accompany the paper. My sense was that the plain packaging was an issue that would first need considerable selling within the public health community because of how radical it was. They would need to be comfortable enough with it to become enthusiastic supporters once it got out there as a policy being advocated for adoption. Being novel and never implemented before, it needed to be thoroughly workshopped in preparation for the inevitable major attacks that it would attract. Instead, a large window of opportunity opened up in the form of a committee. In 2008, I was appointed to the Tobacco Committee of the Preventative Health Task Force, and this had been established as a direct response to the newly elected Rudd government's explicit emphasis on the importance of prevention in health policy. With 50 or so others, I was invited to a briefing by the new Health Minister, Nicola Roxon. Her presentation started with and dwelt on prevention, not in its normal role as a policy confection to be just sprinkled on the real meat and potatoes of health policy like hospital crises and expensive drug subsidies, but as a primary consideration. Here, it seemed, was a rare government sending direct and forceful signals that chronic disease prevention was to be taken seriously. Roxon at once seemed to be one of us, inhabited by the same big picture, population-focused values as the public health community. On the first day of the task force, the chair, Mike Daub from Curtin University, emphasised to us all that his brief had been to convene a committee who should be in no doubt that the government wanted recommendations that would really make a difference. And we took it in terms to propose bold but always evidence-based strategies. A substantial increased tobacco tax, 25%, was unanimous recommendation in the room. And in April 2010, it was adopted by, and a Treasury paper from earlier this year shows that it reduced 11%, consumption by 11%, nearly twice the predicted 6% which had been modelled. I predictably recommended plain packaging, which was again unanimously accepted. And I recall remarks in the room about, look, we can be bold here. It's important that we get it out there on the agenda, even though it actually may take years to get up. That was the spirit of our recommendation, and I don't think there was anyone in the room who really expected that the proposal would have any other life than as an historic but merely noted recommendation in the report. The proposed legislation was first announced on the 29th of April 2010 at a press conference held by the Prime Minister Rudd and Nicola Roxon, although late-night television broke the news the night before. I and others had been called by Roxon's office about 6 p.m. on the 28th because a television station had got wind of the announcement. Now, for those involved, it was one of those occasions like always remembering where you were when John Kennedy or John Lennon was shot or when the moonwalk happened. I picked up the phone at home and Angela Pratt, who was Nicola Roxon's Chief of Staff, said to me deadpan, I thought you might like to know that we'll be announcing in the morning that we'll be introducing plain packaging. Well, I didn't drop the phone, but I nearly did. I'll never forget that moment. It was really one of the highlights of my career. From that moment, everyone working in a population-focused tobacco control in Australia did little else for the next 2 years than concentrate our efforts to ensure the announced bill would be passed. The confluence of a newly elected government with a prevention reformist agenda, the presence in that government of a passionate, whip-smart and articulate minister with great and accessible staff, the opening of a window of opportunity in the form of a task force charged with maximising policy impact, and a small, closely networked and highly experienced circle of policy entrepreneurs advocating for change exemplifies several ingredients of John Kingdon's analysis of policy reform. But these features were all, I would put to you, proximal features, things which were happening around the time that really leave unexplained how a radical idea like plain packaging, when landing on the desk of a new government, found the favour that it did. Proximal factors like those I've mentioned for plain packaging are always necessary to such policies gaining traction, but they're hardly sufficient, as the long trail of detritus of excellent evidence-based proposals that went nowhere should make obvious. It's long been very banal to note that policy adoption is not simply a matter of presenting the best facts and evidence to policymakers and then sitting back to watch quality evidence triumph over all other considerations. With rare exceptions, policy entrepreneurs and advocates need to engage in extended and highly strategic efforts to ensure that evidence is communicated in ways that make it both publicly and politically compelling, so that inaction is not an option. Policy solutions need to be framed in ways that make their rejection problematic. Killer facts need to be mined from eye-glazing data, memorable sound bites constructed and rehearsed, analogies forged with other issues known to have widespread support already, and an instinctive understanding honed of the importance of subtext and the underlining of values in potent and effective communication about proposed policies. While plain packaging represented a novel proposal that had never been before implemented, the case for it rested on the same long-running distal narratives that had seen governments of all persuasions incrementally ban all forms of advertising and promotion, commencing with TV and radio direct advertising in 1976. It was the "you can't be half pregnant" subtext, which allowed Roxon and public health advocates to argue that with plain packaging, we were simply finishing the job of banning tobacco advertising. We'd banned all other forms of tobacco advertising. There was no disputing that packaging was a form of advertising, so therefore the cancer emperor's fancy clothes just had to be removed. Now, if you Google "just like the tobacco industry," your screen will flood with examples of the ethical bottom feeder status of the industry. Big tobacco has long been routinely referenced as the index case for a wide range of dodgy attributes. Dominant public discourses see the tobacco industry as nefarious, duplicitous, venal, as corporate Pied Pipers, purveyors of deadly products, and being indifferent to the health of Australians. A survey from 14 years ago found tobacco industry executives ranked with the standard low watermark, used car salesman, in trustworthiness in the community. These narratives have been current for at least the last 30 years and have grown ever more virulent as smoking prevalence continues in free fall. Because of 6 decades of epidemiology, 3 decades of intense advocacy and incremental government action, and the inexorable denormalisation of smoking, smoking is now an issue with few champions. Any political party seen to be going out of its way to support the tobacco industry's interests risks sending a message that would resonate with a very small proportion of the community. You just don't stand next to the tobacco industry in a photo opportunity. With only 15.7% of Australians smoking each day and 90% regretting that they started, this means that only 1.5% of Australian adults today are smokers who are happy about being smokers, and only a small fraction of these are smokers who care enough to speak out against effective tobacco control measures. Mostly they seem to contact me. Many smokers, in fact, support tobacco control because they believe that it might help them stop. And during the campaign to defend the bill, Roxon said repeatedly that she'd never met a smoker who hoped their own children would grow up to become a smoker. This, I think, was a masterly soundbite, as was another that she used often when she said, "We are killing people by not acting." When I interviewed Nicola Roxon for my book, she emphasised several explanations of why she had taken up the recommendation on plain packs. This was one of the main questions I asked her repeatedly. First, she said, the importance of there being a coordinated, informed and strategically sophisticated research and advocacy community supporting the proposal. Well-respected people coordinated. Not so 10 different people all asking for 20 different things, she said. That happens much more rarely than you would imagine in politics. I think the value of a cut-through of a message like that and how easy it is for then governments to pick it up should not be underestimated. Australia has an extraordinarily well-networked, multidisciplinary and cooperative tobacco control community and a highly professional health bureaucracy, national and international experts in policy evaluation, consumer testing, illicit trade, international trade, copyright and constitutional law, all had a reputation of working seamlessly together to ensure high-quality, rapid advice to government. This gave her confidence that the decades of earlier advocacy and achievement in tobacco control provided what she described as big shoulders to stand on when it came to announcing the next steps, both in the sense of there being community expectations that tobacco control is what governments should do, and the sense that government would be supported by a formidable group of experts. Next, she emphasised the contempt for which the tobacco industry was held across the community. She told me this was a no-brainer. being really bold, taking on big tobacco. How do you lose, even if you lose? Big tobacco, everyone hates them, so really having a fight with them can't hurt. The metamorphosis of the tobacco industry from being just another industry in the 1950s, with its CEOs getting knighthoods, to its ethical pariah status today, did not happen either overnight or by accident. If you work in malaria control, you must study mosquitoes to know how to destroy them. And if you work in lung cancer control, you must study the tobacco industry as a disease vector to learn how to weaken it. We did that for many years, and we drove the industry out of the media spotlight for over a decade in the 1990s, when it obviously took a decision that media appearances were just kicking own goals. A US colleague says that the tobacco industry are like cockroaches. They spread disease and hate the sunlight. So our job became one of throwing as much light on them as possible. A 4-year National Cancer Institute grant that I had early last decade allowed me to look through millions of formerly internal tobacco industry documents, produce 30 papers that helped shatter forever the routine public lies that the industry told about disease, addictions, and its designs on young smokers. Now, from the moment the government's intentions were announced, a series of major enabling goals became evident. These included ensuring that the research informing the design of the new packs would maximise the main goals of the policy, to make cigarettes look as unappealing as possible, and to maximise the impact of the graphic health warnings. Legal expertise was also vital in preparing the anticipated challenges in both Australian courts and internationally, in forums such as the World Trade Organisation, and in drafting the legislation itself. The Health Department needed to steel itself for an obstructionist campaign involving massive requests from the industry under Freedom of Information, fishing for anything that they fantasised might assist their efforts to derail the policy. To understand why a proposal as radical as plain packaging was picked up politically and eventually supported by all political parties, it's also necessary to understand the central place that media advocacy has in the DNA of Australian tobacco control leadership. Every major policy battle that has been won since the 1970s, and they've all been won, has been bitterly contested in the news media by those who stood to lose. We have had a lot of practice over 3 decades. I tell my students each year that if you can get your story on breakfast or drive time radio, or get covered in the early evening TV news bulletins, more people will hear your message than will have heard all the concerts combined of the Rolling Stones, Bruce Springsteen and U2 on their last tours of Australia. But importantly, among that audience are a small number of highly influential people with power to legislate and to allocate resources to your issue. I speak with many researchers who express frustration at the rare opportunities they get to meet with policy makers and politicians. I meet with such people myself relatively few times each year, if that. I tell colleagues and students, however, that I meet these people actually many times each month, often at times when they are at their most relaxed and their most receptive. I'd never met Nicola Roxon before she became Health Minister, and when we first met at a conference, I noted this to her and she said, "Look, I feel I've known you most of my life." Now, this could have only been referring to my long involvement in news media. So while never having previously had the opportunity to put perspectives and proposals to her directly, it was clear that I had done so on uncounted occasions as she woke to early morning radio news and commentary, in her car as she drove to work, via her newspapers, through television news in hotel rooms, and via any online social media feeds that she might have followed. Her cabinet colleagues also would have needed to be voracious news consumers, so when health portfolio items came up, they too would be acquainted with public narratives about these issues that have been circulating in the news media. Many researchers today remain highly ambivalent about media engagement, and some are deeply distrustful. The values implicit in Sir William Osler's 1905 advice that doctors should not dally with the Delilah of the press remain alive today in some academic research circles. Concerns are sometimes muttered about the impropriety of researchers actively engaging with the media to publicise their research, and particularly to advocate for policy, an activity said by some to politicise science. Wilkes and Kravitz's study of first authors whose research received press coverage found that while most authors were satisfied with the coverage, a substantial minority thought that media attention gives the impression that the researcher is seeking publicity and creates jealousy amongst colleagues. Such concerns were echoed in a more recent major study undertaken for the English Royal Society, in which 20% of British scientists believe colleagues who appeared in the media were less well regarded by their peers. They were seen as selling out and seeking self-publicity. To this substantial minority, public engagement was something light or fluffy and done by, this is my favourite, done by those who are not good enough for an academic career. The Royal Society report found that 60% of British researchers want to engage with politicians about their research, but far fewer, only 31%, want to talk to journalists, despite politicians being voracious consumers of news, where they daily encounter expert and public opinion directly relevant to their portfolios. But many researchers engage often and effectively with the media, believing that media coverage of their work has significant benefits. Independent health experts are the sources who are most trusted by journalists covering health issues. Experts, I've found from research I've done, are the second most frequent category of news actor in Australian television health news stories, after those people who are experiencing the health problems themselves. In 2009, I worked on a project looking at the characteristics of influential public health researchers. We interviewed 36 researchers who had been voted by their peers as the 6 most influential researchers in Australia in 6 fields of public health: alcohol, illicit drugs, injury prevention, obesity, skin cancer prevention, and tobacco control. In lengthy interviews, we asked them to try and reflect on why they believed they had been as highly ranked by their peers as they had. And we also interviewed senior policymakers such as politicians, ex-premiers, their staff, senior bureaucrats, and asked them to reflect on how they came to learn about public health expertise, to use and trust such experts, and to regard them as influential. 3/4 of Australian politicians that we interviewed placed great importance on media profile, with media presence sometimes disturbingly considered as commensurate with expertise. For one political advisor, it was the only means of identifying experts. He said to us, "I've absolutely no idea how I would go about identifying someone if there wasn't an obvious expert prominent in the media." The ability of the media to affect policy agenda was of paramount interest to most researchers. Media coverage of health issues had brought the community along with new ways of thinking about public health, and one said to us, without the softening up that the media did, the tobacco control legislation would not have been acceptable as it ultimately was to the community. Significantly, 86% of researchers we interviewed agreed that public health researchers have a duty to increase public awareness of their work, and the same percentage agreed that public health researchers had a duty to influence policy and practice. All but one of the 36 people that we interviewed regularly engaged with the media because of the, quote, huge advantage it provides in getting your research out there. In many cases, this had led to a media profile that, once established, became almost self-perpetuating, with the media returning regularly and the researcher gaining further opportunities to promote their research and expertise. Quote, "They see that you can articulate an issue, and so you tend to get called, and that kind of snowballs into becoming the go-to person." Establishing this relationship was seen to be dependent on several attributes, which included an ability to manage simplification, an instinct for framing, of being able to use metaphor and analogy and so forth, and having an opinion. Some interviews had encountered colleagues who believed that researchers should, quote, just stick to the facts in interviews, but only 2 of our 36 researchers agreed that it's, quote, not appropriate for me to express my opinions about public health policy. The overwhelming majority disagreed, arguing that the public expects experts to go beyond reciting and clarifying facts to provide commentary, to translate data, and to explaining its meaning for policy. They want to see what Professor so-and-so has to say about it because people always want to know what the policy implications are. While nearly everyone would consider it appropriate for experts to appear in news media to explain the facts, journalists and the public expect that experts should also have views worth hearing about what should be done. This is particularly so in public health, where much news is problem-focused. As Shanto Iyangar's work on news has shown, news coverage about problems invariably moves across a 90-second item from descriptions of the problem to a focus on those responsible for the problem and then on to its preferred solutions. Any public health expert who tries to avoid discussion on such solutions will rapidly find themselves marginalised as an authority. The public would reason, well, what sort of expert is this who knows so much about the problem but doesn't seem to have any views about what should be done to fix it? Everyone also has stressed the importance of being available to journalists and appreciating news media routines and of having institutional support to deal with media. Many researchers pointed to the lack of encouragement inherent in traditional academia, which focuses on teaching and research rather than on service to the community or being a public intellectual. But others remarked that this neglect was fading fast, with universities rewarding their media-active staff and urging researchers to keep records of media appearances for institutional profiles. While almost all of the peer-rated influential researchers we interviewed recognised the importance of media engagement, they were also sensitive to concerns about its inherent constraints, the dilemmas posed by differences between journalistic and academic cultures, and the reputational risks from an injudicious embrace of media celebrity. The major concerns were the news media's insistence on brevity and simplification and the resultant dumbing down of complexity, and intolerance for inconclusiveness in encapsulating commentary within sound bites. This group of researchers had developed strategies, though, to overcome these restraints, such as interacting more with media workers that they knew and trusted. Their concerns were offset by the judgment that to absent oneself from the media was almost to guarantee the irrelevance of one's research to public and political debates about health policy. So in summary, the opportunity that media engagement provided for researchers to contribute to research-informed public awareness and debate was regarded not only as appropriate by most of our influential researchers, but as a critical aspect of their professional duty to advance public health. I want to end with a roll call of colleagues who played important roles in this historic episode of public health. Midnight Mike Daub, Professor of Health at Curtin University, who chaired the Task Force Committee, did countless media interviews, often at ungodly West Coast times, and was the main go-to person when any sticky problem needed solving. The brilliant and unsung Michelle Scolo, who wrote the Task Force report, should always be remembered. You probably have never heard her name, but we all know her name intimately. She was just fantastic. The academic lawyers Andrew Mitchell, Tanya Voon, Jonathan Lieberman, Mark Davison, and our own Matthew Rimmer, and those in the Crown Solicitor's Office, their combined expert firepower and Niagara of writings on the arguments was simply formidable. Melanie Wakefield, who's a fellow from the Cancer Council Victoria, and her team, these people are simply the most outstanding researchers in tobacco control, and Melanie is the master of strategic research in this area. an outstanding team of public servants in the Commonwealth Department of Health and Ageing, led and supported by Jane Halton and Nathan Smythe, who must be unnamed, but who all know who they are, who they deservedly won the prestigious Global Luther Terry Medal for the outstanding organisation involved in tobacco control in 2010. Paul Grogan, head of advocacy at the Cancer Council Australia, is also lead guitarist in my band. Rowan Greenland from the Heart Foundation and Michael Moore from the Public Health Association. Each of these people wore out several pairs of shoes walking the corridors of Parliament House lobbying MPs. High-energy tobacco control colleagues like Anne Jones and Becky Freeman, who provided brilliant public commentary over the 2 years. And Mal Washer, the formal Liberal backbencher, who memorably told the Melbourne Age, "The tobacco industry is jumping up and down because they're worried about their businesses. I support these reforms unequivocally, and whatever my party decides to do, I don't give a shit." He threatened to cross the floor if his party opposed the bill, and was probably key to it being unopposed. But of course, the real superhero in all of this is Nicola Roxon and her wonderful staff, who both as Health Minister and as Attorney General had the courage to try and make tobacco history. In 1985, the CEO of Philip Morris in the US said, as one of our Australian colleagues puts it, a sneeze in one country today can cause international pneumonia tomorrow. Already Ireland, New Zealand and Scotland have indicated that they intend to follow Australia. Canada was the first nation to introduce graphic pack warnings in 2000, and today the tumbling dominoes on that policy have seen 64 nations now with those graphic health warnings just 13 years later. When the history of public health in the first half of this century is written, Nicola Roxon's name will be there in neon lights as an Australian political champion of lung cancer control. Future generations will have much to thank her for. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, and I think future generations will have much to thank you for the obviously very important leadership role that you've played in this area. Can I thank you for such a compelling, highly engaging and very thoughtful lecture. I think many of us will be thinking about what you said for many weeks to come, and I'm sure we'll be telling all of our colleagues and researchers in our different institutions that this is a lecture that they must absolutely listen to. You've delivered exactly what we look for in the Cunningham lecture. I'm afraid we don't have any time, or we have no questions built into the lecture, but I'm sure my colleagues here will try and seek you out afterwards, or if they're attending the dinner tonight, to talk to you. But thank you, Simon. It's a brilliant piece of work and you've done an amazing job.